This video lecture will focus on postliberalism. It's some theory that extends beyond the course readings. I've elected to include it because I think it's interesting, and it gives you some resources for doing analysis on some of the landscape of the political that we are currently living in terms of policy making and policy explaining, that will help in your process of meaning making when you see some of the conflicting and contradictory things that politicians do. This video lecture builds on video lecture 1 and 2 that covered previous forms of liberalism, classical liberalism, social liberalism, neoliberalism, and inclusive liberalism, and liberal humanism is in there somewhere as well. So hopefully you've had a chance to watch video lecture 1 and 2. You're moving on to video lecture 3, and hopefully you've also watched some of the supplemental materials like the video on Keynesianism that were included for you on A2L. So I feel a little bit like I'm lost in the woods sometimes when I look at what's happening in the neoliberal landscape of social policy. There's things that happen in both a Canadian context with, for example, Trudeau, or at the provincial level with, I was going to say Mike Harris, but it's not Mike Harris, it's Doug Ford. Interesting. Who is the Premier of the province of Ontario, and some of the contradictory and confusing things that he does. And of course, if I'm feeling like I really want to, go deep into the forest, I can look south of the border at what's happening with Trump and the conflict that exists in the Republican Party around what it means to be a Republican versus what it means to be a Trump Republican. So there's constantly change happening at the political level that affects policy and how policy is made. I'm sure that Pierre Trudeau, father of Justin Trudeau, would say that there are some things that his son does that he doesn't recognize as kind of falling into the traditional Liberal Party platform. Last year, you might recall, many people were critical of Justin Trudeau and a series of policy announcements he made. These policy announcements occurred just a few days apart. First, Trudeau affirmed Canada's commitment to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and efforts to reduce global warming and its impact. Then Trudeau went on to another location in the West where he talked about policy commitments to the oil and gas sector, announcing the continued federal support of oil pipelines. Many people said this was a complete contradiction in which Trudeau made two policy claims that were at best contradictory and perhaps at worst impossible to hold in the same space and time. How could you commit to reduce the effects of global warming and also commit to fossil fuels? Perhaps under a traditional liberal framework, this could be understood as problematic and as maybe even irrational. But under a post-liberal framework, these two ideas may be understood as compatible. So perhaps it's not that Trudeau's a bad politician, it's just that we don't know where we are in our development of liberalism. Or maybe it's just that we need to change the way we think about things. Of course, it's possible he is wrong. But hopefully no one in his party notices, and he can continue with his post-liberal approach. And we can learn a little bit more from this about what it means to consider policy from a post-liberal perspective. To understand this example a bit better, let's think about what post means in post-liberal. As a doctoral student, I spent a lot of time thinking about the traditions of the post, thinking about postmodernism, post-structuralism, and post-colonialism. There are some other traditions of the post that are less popular, that people aren't as fond of, something called post-race theory and post-feminism, which people often find quite repugnant because they suggest that we're talking about post as meaning after or at the conclusion of something, and we know we haven't dealt with racism or sexism in our society. So sometimes when we talk about the posts, we're talking about eras of time. So we can understand, for example, postmodernism as an era. But we can also understand it as a theoretical orientation. Some people would say it's a rejection of theory, but there are still other ways of looking at it. So notions of the post can be about rejecting particular kinds of claims or introducing new practices that aim to replace old ways of dealing with particular issues or responding to the social world. Postmodernism might be understood as the rejection of exclusivity of claims made under modernism. So when we think about the idea of the post as it relates to post-liberalism, We're concerned with rejection of the exclusivity of particular ways of dealing with the world that flow from classical or traditional liberalist perspectives, in particular the notion of foundationalism. We're looking for a new way of understanding and responding that reflects concerns about contexts and the specifics of settings. When we think about post-liberalism, we need to remember that the liberal, in all of its many manifestations, is still hanging around. So we're talking about echoes of traditional liberalism, classical liberalism, liberal humanism, social liberalism, inclusive liberalism, and neoliberalism as still being in operation. Sometimes the differences between these perspectives and this continuum operates in a synergistic way. It works well. But there are other times when there is competition with different perspectives on the continuum. The differences within these perspectives account for a spectrum of values, policies, and actions. However, post-liberalism challenges the significance of this foundationalist logic. Post-liberalism is more concerned with the need to enshrine liberal values. The point of liberalism is to make liberalism. So the nature of its political activity should emphasize actions and activities and ways of understanding the world that may be fundamentally understood as liberal. They are concerned with the individual and the individual's unfettered participation in the market in order to manifest their good life. How this occurs is of less consequence. Post-liberalism attends to the retrenchment of goods and services with the goal of protecting individuals from the problem of capitalism in ways that are liberal. There is a desire to reduce government and to reduce government intervention such that it reflects actions and activities more closely associated with traditional liberalism, in that the role of the state is to develop policies that reduce the potential for any kind of interference in individual rights and freedoms. Social inclusion is expressed through notions of social investments. In other words, the social means encouraging the market and encouraging the people to go to the market when they have needs. The inclusion in social inclusion is inclusion in the market. You ought to be able to get what you need from the market. You ought to be able to buy it. The information that I've provided about post-liberalism is really just a tiny skim of the information that's available. This list contains a number of readings that you might find interesting if you'd like to pursue a deeper dive into the world of post-liberalism. This was again just an opportunity to touch on some theory that we haven't read much about in class, but that might become relevant as you do your own research or start to read some articles that might mention the perspective. I hope that this video lecture has been useful for you, and I'll look forward to connecting with you at our Zoom meeting.